capitalist classes are telling us that this is the end of history. Capitalism has won the global economy, is upon us and can't be turned back. You know, we just have to live by whatever the dictates of the market are. But I don't really believe that, and I don't think you believe that either. I was wondering if either of you have thought about how the next phase of struggles will develop. Will there be rebellions in various countries against the New World Order? Will there be increasing resentment here in the United States because we're asked to play such a large role in assuring capitalist dominance in the New World Order? How do you conceive resistance developing?
Well, first thing to bear in mind is that this talk about the end of history and the victory and, you know, the utopia of the masters and so on, we've been hearing that for 170 years. I won't run through the whole history, but it's a periodic affair. It looks as if as if opposition's been smashed, the labor movement's been destroyed, people are back in their holes, and so on and so forth, and then a few years later everything blows up. So without going back to the 1830s when it begins, just take, say, the 1920s. What Howard was talking about a bit, after the Red Scare. The country's leading labor leader, also presidential candidate, was in jail, put there by Woodrow Wilson because he questioned the nobility of Wilson's war. The labor movement was destroyed. And by violence. This was no joke. You know, the United States has a very violent labor history. This is the period of the big mass production of automobiles and so on. Labor just had nothing to do with it. They were virtually wiped out. People were afraid to have meetings in big formerly union towns, working class towns. It was too frightening. There was a lot of euphoria about how everything was wonderful, you know, end of history, terrific, and so on. A couple of years later, the country was in total turmoil. You know, workers taking over plants, forcing through legislation that brought the United States more or less into the mainstream of industrial society, what we call the New Deal measures. That caused huge hysteria on the part of the masters. They was very, very worried about it. Huge campaign started right in the late 30s to try to beat everybody back into their shells. During the Second World War, was kind of put on hold, started off right away afterwards. By the 1950s, it was again a period of celebration of apathy and quiescence and the end of ideology and everything's fine. Now it's just a little tinkering around the edges. A couple of years later, Howard students are out on the streets, everybody else is out on the streets, the whole country is blowing up, and we have a crisis of democracy. Well, since then, since the early 70s, there's been another major effort to try to restore apathy and obedience and so on. And what will happen next? If anybody, nobody's ever succeeded in predicting in the past. You take a look at the record. You can't predict tomorrow's weather, you know. To try to predict what will happen in human affairs is completely out of the question. I mean, these aren't things that you sit around making predictions about. They're things you try to do something about. And there's plenty of opportunity. I mean, you know, it's striking. I travel like Howard does, not only here, but also around the world, and it's very different. It's interesting to hear where you hear questions about what we should do, mostly in privileged sectors. So, for example, including in the United States, I just came back from a couple of weeks ago from Brazil. You know, Brazil's it's ranked next to Albania in the UN Development Report. It should be an extremely rich country. It's had the benefit of our tutelage for 50 years. Certainly should have helped it. Brazil has the biggest radical democratic party in the world, labor-based party run by a steel worker peasant from the Northeast, they'd easily win any election if you could possibly have a fair election. I mean, they get smashed by the 100% of the media at the last minute, but otherwise they'd have won the last 2 presidential elections. It's a kind of an umbrella group, which includes all sorts of social movements. Independent, I happened to spend some time meeting with them, including Lula leadership. Independently of that, there's 150,000 or so families in a landless workers movement, completely separate, just taking over land. A lot of struggle, like a lot of them get killed, and it's going on right now all the time. Independently of all that, there's a big network of rural trade unions for rural proletariat. A lot of the land is unused. People want it. They want to organize for it. There's indigenous movements. There's big popular media projects. I mean, here everybody complains about how we can't get onto the media. There, I spent an evening at a popular media project out in the, Brazil's like Europe, the opposite of the United States in the way cities are organized. The downtown is the rich place and the suburbs are the poor place. By and large. So out in the suburbs, a place with a couple of million people living in something ranging from suffering to misery, there are public television in the squares, with helped a little by an NGO, a couple of professionals from the town, but all they do is provide the equipment. They come out with a truck and a big screen and set it up in a public square, and a couple hundred people gather, and they see things that are done by the people in the community. They see it's written by them, directed by them, acted by them. The actors, when I was there, the main actress was a kid, looked about 17, was walking around in the crowd interviewing people about people who were sitting at a bar, standing and talking to their kids or something, about the programs that they were seeing. Their comments were broadcast on the screen. People were talking about that. Big project, and these, and on and on. These are people with no resources, I mean, very, very poor people, and projects coming all over the place. I mean, for us to talk about the inability to deal with things is sort of, it's something really wrong about it. I mean, we should not ask that kind of question. There are so many opportunities with the resources we have, and when you see people with no resources, it's pretty striking. And that's the same is true in the United States. And I think we should take a lesson from that. As far as the globalization and the triumph of the free market is concerned and all that business, I mean, I won't repeat, but it's, as far as the free market is concerned, probably the last time there was anything remotely like a free market was the Asian trading area before the merchant adventurers broke into it about 500 years ago. It was vaguely like a free market. Ever since then, there's been a kind of a double-edged free market. Free markets are great for you, but I need the protection of a powerful state. And that's exactly the way it is now. What I said about telecommunications is absolutely standard. It's true of every part of the economy. I mean, the leading welfare freak in the country happens to be Newt Gingrich, who brings more public subsidies to his district than any comparable district in the country. The most protectionist government in post-war history was the Reagan administration. Probably doubled protectionism, saved, plus pouring tons of money into industry. That's what saved, the steel industry, the automotive industry, the semiconductor industry, and so on. Just a couple of weeks ago, Japan announced that they were going to set up a big program to rebuild the semiconductor industry in Japan to try to compensate for the advantages that the U.S. industry had gotten through Reaganite protectionism and public funding. Same day, this is all on the business pages, it's not on the front page. Same day, the business pages reported that the United States, the Clinton administration had decided that the next, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of jet planes would not go to McDonnell Douglas, which builds jet planes, but to Boeing, which produces commercial aircraft because they need the shot in the arm from the publicly produced technology, which then they can convert to commercial uses. That's what's called capitalism. If you look at there is a good technical study of the top 100 transnational corporations. Just came out about a year ago in England on the Fortune list. They found that all 100 of them had benefited from the industrial policies of their home countries, and 20 were saved from total destruction either by public takeover or bailout when they got into trouble. That's free market capitalism, right across the board. It's fine for 7-year-old kids, but not for rich people. They need protection, and they get plenty of it in all these ways. That's part of what the university is about. As far as globalization is concerned, it's real, and you can argue about whether it's good or bad, but it's not, the scale is nothing particularly novel. In fact, as a number of people have pointed out, by gross measures like trade and investment flows and that sort of thing, it's about back to what it was around 1913. I mean, there are some differences. They're striking, mostly in financial capital, the speed with which speculative capital moves around, which incidentally is a reflection of state policy, in many ways, including the telecommunications that makes it possible. So that's an outgrowth of the state sector of the economy. But there's nothing. And in fact, of the interchanges globally, about 3/4 of them are within Europe, Japan, and the United States. That is 3 regions where there are at least formally democratic policies in place. That is, you can make policy without fear of military coups, at least, which is not a small thing, meaning the public has formal mechanisms to determine how this works. If the mechanisms aren't used, well, okay, that's something you try to do something about. But the idea that it's either free market capitalism or out of control, or something totally new, or the end of history, I mean, this is not a word of this, I don't think, can be sustained. As far as predictions, it seems to me pointless to worry about them. Nobody's ever been predicting correctly in the past. We won't predict properly now. The thing is to do something about it.
I'm a member of an organization called the Spartacus League, which is a revolutionary socialist organization. And I think it's pretty safe to say that if you take a look at society and history, that all the problems in society, whether it be imperialist war, increasing racist attacks on blacks and immigrants, attacks on women and so forth, things like that, always are derived from the same thing, which is the capitalist system that which we live in. That is a system where production is for private profit as opposed to social use. And what I and with the organization I represent think is that what has to happen in order to be able to provide, for example, homes for the homeless, or to fight back against the attacks on abortion rights, or all these questions all across the board, is basically the same thing. We think that the working class, which the multiracial, integrated working class, which are the people who have their hands on the direct means of production, the factories, the railroads, so forth, that they have to basically lead a revolution in this country and across the world, for that matter, that is going to take power out of the hands of the capitalist class, and that's going to introduce a social system in which production, will be used so that you don't have all these what I'm looking for, contradictions that have been discussed tonight. Thousands of dollars being spent on missiles when you can take a walk around Harvard Square and see all the homeless people, for example. And what we think is really necessary for the forging of that revolution is going to be a multiracial party based on, that's what I'm looking for here. Multiracial party that acts, as Lenin said, as a tribune of all the oppressed. That is, that focuses the fight against black oppression, women's oppression, oppression of homosexuals, and so forth, into one unifying party that can fight against all of these problems. And I think that, for example, our organization over the past summer led a demonstration against the Ku Klux Klan in Chicago, in which we were successful in preventing these racist terrorists from promoting.
Please make a question. There are a lot of people waiting here. Come on.
Let me just say to the assemblage, we do have limited time.
I'll be just
So take a yeah. If you have a question, just state.
Well, I don't really have a question.
No, I think you've made you've given us a good analysis, and thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to
Well,
ask
I would
you.
just like to encourage people to check out our newspaper, The Workers' Day. This is the much touted democracy of the universities that we've been hearing so much about. Thanks, guys.
Professor Chomsky, my question was, you mentioned earlier your talk about public spending. You broke it down into two categories, that being social spending and military spending, one being democratic, the other being not. I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit on the logic behind that and also kind of delineate where the line can be drawn between military and spending. I mean, obviously, you know what a school bus and Boeing 727 is, but just explain the logic behind it.
Well, I don't really think that that's the right breakdown. What I tried to say is that in the late 40s, that was the choice. The choice was when the business community was talking about how to ensure that public funds went to advanced sectors of industry, there were sort of two obvious channels. One is various means of social spending, which would stimulate the economy. They understood that. And the other was military spending, and they almost unanimously hit upon military spending. On the other hand, military spending is mostly, it's not really for military purposes. Like take, say, Boeing, which you mentioned. Boeing is the leading exporter, civilian exporter in the United States, called the leading civilian exporter. Aircraft is the leading civilian export. A big trade surplus from aircraft. Furthermore, one of the biggest service industry is tourism, which is, of course, aircraft-based, which brings big surpluses back to the United States. Well, what is all this based on? Well, it's based on military production. That's where the electronics is developed, and the avionics, and the metals, and all the fancy stuff comes from military aircraft, military transports, or bombers or fighters, and then it's transferred over to commercial industry. This dual-use technology does give a step up to almost all production. And as I mentioned, the telecommunications industry, well, that was developed as military production. But of course, that means the internet and fiber optic transmission and so on and so forth. So you can't really break down military and civilian spending. They're integrated, and the military system has been used as a cover for ensuring that the public funding goes to advanced sectors of industry. That's been the way the U.S. economy has been working for a long time. I mean, maybe there's nothing more dramatic than computers, which are kind of core of a modern economy. In the 1950s, computers were not commercially marketable. So they were being developed at places like Lincoln Labs, under MIT lab out in Lincoln, within the framework, guise, I think, but that's a value judgment, but at least within the framework of an air defense system. I don't think anybody seriously thought it was going to defend anybody from Russian airplanes, but it did develop the basic architecture and structure and software and so on for what became commercial computers, and one of the people high up in that project then went off and set up Dell, and then IBM got into the act, and so on and so forth. And that's about the way it goes. So it's not military spending serves a very definite function, I think essentially the function that Symington described. It disguises subsidy as by security. But I think that ought to be completely broken down, and these ought to be issues in the public arena which people ought to make decisions about. What the decisions ought to be, I don't think are so obvious. Like, how should the technology of the future be developed, and who should pay for it, and what should it be, and so on. Those are not so simple questions. But at least we ought to be able to agree on one thing. There are questions that ought to be made in the public, by the public, through direct participation, not in secret by the guys who are going to get to whom it's going to be given under the guise of security.
First of all, I'd like to thank both of you for doing the work that you have over the past 30 years. I think that for me, who had learned about it only 5 years ago, it's been an enlightening experience. My question is, we've been talking a lot about the social movements and social change, and there seems to be, in this period of time, another issue that's come up that has really changed the dynamic about how things have changed. And that is the environmental movement, and a lot of people feel the crisis in the environment. It's really crossed a lot of class lines. I run a small hedge fund. A lot of people I deal with are very concerned about these issues and are willing to put considerable capital behind changing the system as it is, because they believe that things have to change fundamentally for us to reduce CO2 emissions and things like that. My question is, a lot of the vision for how things would change would be very similar to what Newt Gingrich did in '94. And that is that the way that Newt Gingrich attacked things was that he recruited and then trained and funded a whole group of representatives to try to change the nature of Congress and therefore the way these policies would be dealt with. And there are a number of people who are in the environmental movement who are of the opinion that that is the way that things should be done. And if you were to commit significant sum of money, if you were to estimate that it would cost, if you could come up with, say, $300 million, an election cycle, that you could tip the scales enough to make this change. My question is, what is do you see an alternative vision, since both of you have studied this kind of social change in some depth? I was wondering if you should comment on alternative vision for that change.
How much time do we have?
Remember Noam spoke about powers behind the scenes? Yeah. We take our orders from people back here who tell me that, you think this should be the last question? Is that what you're saying?
I have good news, 5 more questions.
Yeah. Just say something quickly. I guess you're asking about the pouring of money into electoral campaigns. Or other options. Well, there'd better be other options. Yeah, because, I mean, if there's anything we've learned from social movements over a period of time, is that social change does not come about through the electoral process. It's helpful. It's not a bad idea to get, A in over B. I mean, most of the time we have it's A or A prime. But if we have A over B, yeah, it's better. But where fundamental injustices have existed in this society, and the history of the labor movement shows this, history of the women's movement, the anti-war movement, gay movement, disabled people's movement, the initiatives have not come from Congress, the President, the Supreme Court. The initiatives have come from citizens' movement, people's movements. And then, whether you have a Republican or a Democrat up there, whether you have A or B up there, if you have a movement powerful enough, they will have to respond to that. So that's my sort of quick judgment on that.
I'm afraid we really do have to end, and let me just add last footnote. If we're thinking about buying elections, if that's the arena in which conflict is going to take place, we can make a pretty safe guess as to who's going to buy them.
If you made a direct plea openly that, even if you bidding war, obviously you would lose.
Yeah, that's right.
But
I don't think things either can be or ought to be done in secret. We try to do it. There are much more powerful forces that can do things in secret. We have to do things in public. What our strength is people, nothing else, I think.
Hi, this is Roger Leisner for Radio Free Maine. And you've been watching Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn speaking on the Cold War and the university.
Excuse me, sir.
This presentation is also available on audio tape and videotape. For a copy of this tape, please contact Roger Leisner, Radio Free Maine, Post Office Box 2705, Augusta, Maine 04338, Right now we're standing outside the North Gate at Bath Iron Works in Bath, Maine, where during the previous week,
Just took Phil and Tom Lewis away.
and this is Jim Freeman.
Roger, they just arrested Phil and they just arrested Tom Lewis and took them away.
Now by Phil we mean Phil Berrigan.
And Tom Lewis.
And they previously had thrown blood on the Aegis destroyers,
That's
correct?
That's correct.
And this is Jim Freeman
Hi, Roger.
from Verona. And we have how many groups here, Jim?
Oh, several groups here, Roger. Probably 8 to 10 different groups. Veterans for Peace, Maine Peace Action, Let Cuba Live, Atlantic Life Community, a number of groups.
Hi, what do you think Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn would say if they were here today?
I think they would probably join right in with us. Yeah, no question about it.
And your name is Francis, if I remember correctly.
You have a very good memory.
And you're from the Portland area?
Yes,
And you're with which group today?
Pax Christi Portland.
Ah, yes, the Roman Catholic group.
Yes, Since these people are all Catholics, we feel we had to be up here, you know.
Well, that's true too. Yeah. But let me remind everybody that this is an interreligious event, and a Methodist is behind the camera.
Absolutely, okay, you're welcome.
And what would you think Chomsky and Zinn would say if they were here today?
They would be fully supportive. They'd be holding up their own banners.
All right.
That's what I think. They'd be right with us.
And